Hello everybody! Welcome to the first video in a three-part series which goes into detail about the play created by myself and a group mate entitled Rhys in the Spotlight, or Rhys yn ei chwyddwydre. This video will go into detail about the creation of the play itself. We'll be looking at a few major topics today, namely the story and the source material, script writing, character formation, practitioners, props and costumes, set and lighting design, and sound design.
Listening, part 1. For questions 1 to 8, choose the best answer.
It was early November of the delightful year 2023 when we officially began working on creating a piece to perform. Before this, we'd been working on a play called Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, which is heavily based upon the practitioner Brecht's style of performing. Given that our group consisted of a mere 2 people, and Waiting for Godot is largely a 2-person play, even though it does include other characters that are also quite major, but the part we worked on was mostly 2 people. We didn't. Since Waiting for Godot was a largely 2-person play, it seemed suitable for us not to stray too far from its general style. Since the piece we create this year is meant to explore the potential and possibilities in responding to take part in the community arts project, as was written on our brief, we decided to focus on bringing awareness to a local issue to improve people's lives, which is a very broad statement. A noticeable issue within communities today is that of social media. So we decided to make our piece about social media versus mental health. The stage we're currently in this part of the process, is brainstorming. At this point in time, our story, characters, and ideas are all germinating. Editor's note. If you are curious about our initial ideas of the characters, there's a presentation video that I uploaded, which will very likely be on either the same page as this, and if it's not, then it will be on a button underneath the video. The characters that Ed and I played in Waiting for Godot were Estragon and Vladimir, respectively. Estragon is a more absent-minded character who's not necessarily optimistic, but he's content no less, whilst Vladimir is more brainy. He considers all the different possibilities and appears to be a chronic overthinker. I decided that this would be a good inspiration for forming my own character, though there is a distinct difference between Alwyn and Vladimir, in that Alwyn is quite out of touch with reality, in opposition to Vladimir's hyper-awareness. After a day of brainstorming, the character named Alwyn Rhys had come into fruition. The preliminary idea, as I wrote down in my slides from the early days, was this. My character, Alwyn, is a politician about 6 years older than myself who finds his way into many fights on social media. He does not react well to any of them, and they cause him an immense amount of distress. By the final performance, Alwyn was a fully fledged, 3-dimensional character who had memorable traits, and was a representation of an important message all the while. Alwyn is a memorable character because of the way his presence can make an audience feel. One trait about him is that he's very obsessive and attached towards his phone and social media at large. This was represented on stage by me, the actor, showing the audience that Alwyn will never put his phone down. Even when he was talking to Mikey and not using it, he was still holding onto it in his hands, flipping it and fiddling with it. In scene 5, when Mikey pressures Alwyn to put the phone down on his table, Alwyn reluctantly wheels the chair towards the table and stops just before in an effort to continue using his phone. After that, he is visibly distressed, more so when he finds out the phone was tampered with. Everything about Alwyn up until that part of scene 5 screams separation anxiety between him and his phone. A second facet of his character that leaves a lasting memory in the audience is the combination of his steadfast stubbornness and his distorted view of reality. He views himself as above other people in terms of intelligence, status, and worth. One of the biggest indicators of this is when he notes to Mikey that he outwardly voiced his distaste for the Equality Act. I guess that there's that one time I posted outwardly voicing my distaste for the Equality Act. Maybe that. For reference, the Equality Act of 2010 is legislation that was put in place in the UK on the 1st of October 2010, which replaced the previous legislation that protected specific groups of people from discrimination, instead protecting society at large. The items that were in place up until the 30th of September 2010 were the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975, Race Relations Act of 1976, and Disability Discrimination Act of 1995. The replacement of all the different laws with one made it easy to understand and covered more people who were previously not legally protected. His distaste for the Equality Act implies that it is a hindrance to his ideal life, which indicates very heavily that he has a warped and outdated view of life. He then goes on to call other people all sorts of insulting things that are simply not true. Very often, somebody who calls every single other person delusional or crazy is the delusional or crazy person themselves. Alwyn is a character written to be the human embodiment of three main ideas, namely, the impact that social media has had on those who are already dealing with mental health issues, the radicalization that social media can bestow onto its users, and the constant fighting on social media with its anonymous users. Let's take a look at these ideas one by one and examine how Alwyn mirrors them. This aspect of Mr. Rhys was formulated via first-hand experiences and anecdotes from others. I've asked a few friends who had been particularly online in the past year or so, and they all gave different experiences about how social media has worsened their overall well-being, but that it was still very hard to find a way to stop using it. A similar occurrence rooted in my own case, and I decided to base Alwyn heavily upon these anecdotes. It is a common phenomenon that people on social media can tend to share very harmful, radical, and discriminatory beliefs, often without even realizing. Social media tends to have these really strange ways of thinking, like an all or nothing thought process, or an us versus them narrative, which gives a large quantity of its user base the confidence to say outlandish, judgmental, and borderline supremacist things. Alwyn represents this idea with his willingness to comment on the Equality Act and to hold himself upon a high pedestal whilst putting others down. This one is quite self-explanatory. It was one of the very first ideas I had for Alwyn, and the scene where he's amidst such an argument was the first to be written, despite not being first in the play. Fun fact, the whole spiel in the play about changing one letter in a non-profane word to an asterisk actually happened! In March of 2023, I mindlessly replied on Twitter to a post in which there was this video with sound with the asterisk as referenced, and I got plenty of upset responses from strangers. Something notable, however, is that the hate symbols image scenario was not based on any of my real life experiences. Ed and I ended up deciding that it would be a good idea to have parts of the play be monologues, that is, a long speech by one person, especially within a play, movie, or television show. Essentially, significant portions of the piece were to consist of either myself or my groupmate alone on stage. There were a multitude of reasons for such a decision. One of the main ones was practicality. Having lots of scenes be monologues would make it quite a bit easier to practice in our own time, and would mitigate the need for the two of us to be constantly shifting our schedules to fit in extra rehearsal slots given the time we had. In professional environments, it's a stroke of luck to have more than 2 weeks to work on something like this, which is quite a stark contrast to the time we had. From start to finish, that is, November 6th of 2023 to March 19th of 2024, we had 19 weeks and 1 day in total. There were not rehearsals every single day, but there was plenty of time to complete this project if we were rehearsing professionally. For more information about the rehearsals themselves rather than the process, I recommend watching the second video in this series titled Rehearsal Log, as this one focuses on the creation itself. Following the brainstorming, character formation, and making the ideas of the story and structure for our play, it came time to collate them all into a script. The first things to write up were our monologues, or the first ones, in my case, which I did at home with the moral support of my little brother Patrick. I ended up sticking to the script I wrote despite making many hundreds of edits, but Ed felt more comfortable using a different approach. I was using some methods of Stanislavski to get into character and form the basis of Alwyn, and my groupmate Ed was using those of Meisner, Those two practitioners are quite different in the way they approach acting as a whole and character development, but Ed decided not to continue with the draft that he'd first come up with. And I don't really blame him that much, because this is the very, very first draft. And even in my case, the final product in the script really didn't look all that much like the first draft. I would say there's maybe a 50 to 60% similarity for the first scene that I wrote, which was scene 2. From this, I decided that it would be best for me to take on the responsibility of script writing, given that I'm most comfortable on stage when I know what I'm supposed to say and do. However, being the only scriptwriter was all but easy. My endeavour lasted from about November 14th, 2023 to February 22nd, 2024. Simply sitting down to work on something arguably quite monotonous is something that I struggle with immensely. That includes the script for this very video, by the way. And this. I spent 30 hours during the Easter holiday writing this. And it's due tomorrow and I'm not done. Yay! But, as Vladimir and Estragon would say, nothing to be done. There was only so much procrastination that could happen before doom would pend. Doom is here. February 2nd, 2024 was the arbitrary-ish deadline I set for myself because I thought it would give the two of us enough time to memorize our lines. The memorization process was hilly at best, and I'll go in more detail about it in the next video. Alwyn is visiting a therapist due to his severe addiction to social media. Throughout their meetings, Mikey, the therapist, gives him different pieces of advice and things to try in order to get Alwyn out of his current situation. Alwyn does not try any of the things, and only treats Mikey like a nuisance, so Mikey ends up getting upset with him, deleting all of his social media and leaving after a year. Alwyn seems to have ended up trying the things Mikey said to do, and has become a better person, but he receives a letter from Mikey. This letter turns out to be a suicide note. Due to our circumstantial limitations, there could only have been 2 characters. This story was formed together between the two of us, and was partially inspired by the characters we played in Waiting for Godot. In short, my character would display more emotion and Ed's would be more stoic. The first scene is about getting to know all the characters, and immediately it is clear what Alwyn's all about. He walks in whilst on a phone call. He's flipping his phone around in his hands when he isn't using it. He just cannot seem to put it down. A bit later in the scene, Alwyn disregards Mikey's advice, showing his unwillingness to change and heal. To represent the issues of social media through the story, we included a monologue scene, scene 2, where we see Alwyn's social media usage in action. The audience seeing him in such distress about using social media would have thoughts going through their heads about whether this has happened to them or somebody they know. Of course, maybe not to the same degree and frequency that Alwyn seems to find himself entangled in, but the point is that Alwyn is an exaggerated character who represents everything bad about social media. When they meet up for the second time in the play, Alwyn's demeanor from scene 1 is on show again. And when Mikey takes his phone to do something with it, Alwyn is very clearly stressed out. Mikey and Alwyn have a big argument where social media is deleted for obvious reasons. All thus far clearly depicts somebody with an addiction to social media. So, when there is a dramatic turnaround in scene 6, it comes as a shock. What do you mean Alwyn's made progress and is a better person now? That's crazy. However, when Alwyn finds out about Mikey's death on his own terms, it comes as another massive surprise both to Alwyn and the audience. But why was that scene necessary? The scene where Alwyn reads the letters from Alana, or Mikey's mother, and Mikey himself, was included to act as a representation of consequences. A reminder to the audience that just because you may have changed and become better, you were still hurting others in the past by what you did. And you mustn't wait too long to make attempts to reconcile with them, like Alwyn did. Of course, the consequences in this fictional scenario are absurd as well, which aim to alienate the audience. There were a series of questions pertaining to social media that I asked my friends via social media.
Number 1, has social media noticeably improved your happiness in the past year? And number 2, do you think the environment on social media has become more or less healthy over the past year? 第一个问题，最近的一年时，社美是否显著提高了你的幸福感？第二个问题，最近的一年时，你觉得社美环境改到比较恶浊，还是改到比较安定 ？Question 1. Ayo cyfryngau cymdeithasol wedi gwella dihapus rwydd yn sylweddol yn ystod y flwyddyn ddiwethaf? Question 2. Ydych chi'n meddwl bod amgylchedd a'r gyfryngau cymdeithasol wedi dod yn fwy neu'n llai iach dros y flwyddyn ddiwethaf?
And here are some of my favourite responses. I believe social media is steadily spiralling downwards. Every single person thinks they're right and everyone else is wrong, and that leads to arguments, threats, and many more bad things. In my opinion, there's no big problem with social media, but some students in this school send harassment messages to me. I've already dealt with them, but we're better to be careful around toxic people. This one is from my grandmother. Hello, Dominic. I've had years of pleasure and esteem from social network Twitter since 2014. However, it has been less so more recently. Not so straightforward, and loss of contact with long-time followers. I'm losing interest in continuing to pursue my first interest of gardening on Twitter. And yes, I see less that is of interest on my timeline, and increasingly more gossip, speculation and trivia. Much pessimism and gloom. It hasn't changed much in the past year, still as toxic as it was before. Smiley face. Social media comment sections have definitely become more deranged and horrific to look at because of the amount of either creeps or people who are small-minded and cruel in nature. I also decided to conduct some research via the internet. I looked at the different ways that social media can have an effect on one's mental health. Jacqueline Sterling, PhD psychologist, says that Instagram's decision to add the option to hide the number of likes was a step in the right direction. But she also mentions that likes are not the only means of comparison that one can make between themselves and others on social media. The McLean Hospital also mentions that social media activates the brain's reward center, which are the areas of the brain in which certain hormones such as dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins are released. Dopamine acts as an agent which affects concentration, movement, memory, mood, learning, sleep, motivation, and other bodily functions. It can have an additional effect of causing satisfaction and pleasure, but this is not its primary purpose. Social media exploits the production of a bunch of chemicals from this part of the brain in order to keep its users on it for a longer amount of time. Think back to 6 years ago. Each social media app that you were using was different. Each of those apps and sites had their own niche in which they thrived. However, once the success of a specific app named TikTok had become clear, especially during quarantine of 2020, many apps began to take inspiration in terms of its short-form content viewing methods. Now we have Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, the annoying blurry swipe up for more bar on the bottom of Twitter videos, Reddit I think has scrollable videos, WeChat has them, TikTok and Douyin have them of course, but those are where they're from. Musical.ly had them before it became TikTok, Xiaohongshu has them. Social media now appears to be littered with it. This type of content is very short and very overstimulating and quite a lot of the time dumbed down, so it's theorized that it has adverse effects on the attention span of its consumers. On a different note, what was Alvin on about in scene 6? In the performance there was a very minor case of a severe memory slip, but I'll play a video clip of the part I'm referencing now. These people on social media kept talking about, what was it? There were plenty of things, but it was this thing about dopamine and it's how activities that would give you a lot of dopamine in a short time would be so detrimental to your health or something. And you know, always be careful because advice never applies to everybody, and you need to be careful what you believe. But I agreed with them at first, before realizing that I have a severely chronic deficiency. And yeah. Alwyn remarks that these people on social media treat dopamine like it's the plague to be avoided. This is reflective of a real-life idea going around, and that I have personally seen all too often. A lot of people are preaching a lifestyle that intentionally limits the amount of dopamine they receive by actively avoiding doing things that are making them happy, and they say it improves their lives. This trend is known as dopamine fasting. Dopamine fasting was supposed to be able to help people practice self-control over habits they had that they weren't happy with, and they believed were caused by dopamine. The reason people think dopamine is a pleasure chemical is because of its relation and implication to drug addiction. But, as this article puts it, scientists see the biggest dopamine surge in anticipation of a reward, not in response to one. This coincides well with the purpose of dopamine, which, as a quick reminder, helps with concentration, learning, motivation, etc. Alwyn was talking about how he believed the misinformation that was spread across social media, and how he did not realise that participating in this fad had a disproportionately adverse effect on his own mental health. This is one of the ways that social media can be extremely detrimental to a person's mental health, and one of the main warnings that our play aimed to give. Being neurodivergent and having pre-existing mental health issues myself, this phenomenon has crept up on me more times than I'm okay with. There will always be somebody preaching advice on social media about concentration, studying, homework, social interaction, dopamine fasting, emotions, a really wide range of things, and it simply doesn't work for me like it works for others. Now that I'm more familiar with all of this, by virtue of well-meaning but tragically clueless people constantly telling me I just need to use a calendar and plan ahead, I can tune all of it out, consigning it to the fire pit I call the neurotypical advice category. And unfortunately that category goes to the fire. However, a few years ago, I tried a lot of these things that people were recommended, and all I felt was disappointment in myself when I couldn't get any of it to work.
What? I don't understand.
The way I wrote the script reflected the format of the script for Waiting for Godot. This is because I decided to incorporate some of the elements of Brecht into our piece. Something that Brecht would often stand out for was his mildly lengthy and tedious stage directions that told the actors exactly what to do and when to do it. When we were working on Waiting for Godot, this type of scripting provided me great solace. Upon seeing the scripts and stage directions resulting from Brecht's method, I became very interested in him. So, how did I integrate remnants of Brecht into the piece, aside from the aforementioned stage directions?
Don't go any closer. You don't want to see. See? See what?
Something that enhanced the atmosphere of the play was the audio tracks we used. My little brother Patrick was generous enough to offer to sit backstage and play different tracks on cue. In plays that utilize the method of Brecht, the audience will very often hear accompanying music or sounds or sound effects played. I composed 2 of my own pieces for this play, but I will talk about this sound design a bit later in the video. A classic element in Brecht plays is the distancing effect or the alienation effect, an idea involving the utilization of different techniques within a theatrical performance that aims to distance the audience from the play and the world of the characters in terms of their emotional involvement, serving as a reminder of the artificiality of theatre and performance. There are a plethora of different instances in the final piece in which the audience is alienated from the world of the play and reminded that they are not part of the world of Alwyn and Mikey, instead being onlookers. There are times when the audience is addressed directly via a judgmental glance from Alwyn.
You need as many people side with you as possible.
Mikey referencing Alwyn's opinions being scrutinized by a large audience.
It will be heavily scrutinized by a large audience.
Alwyn referring to the audience as other people.
Other people? But why would I listen to other people?
Mikey speaking aside to the audience about Alwyn's suspension.
He's suspended from his job.
Almost all of scene 2, where Alwyn is talking to the audience directly.
It just seems to keep going round and round in a hellish spectacle. Why must I always be the target?
Scene 3, where Mikey does something similar.
Oh, when did you all get here?
And during scene 6, where Alwyn says he needs an audience to listen to his letter.
Now that you guys are here, I've been writing this letter very recently, and I really need an audience to listen to it.
Breaking the fourth wall is an acquired taste, and many people may find it to be discomforting or irritating. In my case, the aim was to get the audience to feel mildly uneasy when Alwyn addressed them. Especially given that Alwyn, from the beginning, was shown to be a very difficult character to talk to. The audience feeling this alienation and discomfort alongside the partial emotional disengagement to the characters as a result of our efforts to alienate them is parallel to the way that social media can make someone feel. With its solitary nature of superficial friendship, performative and idealized displays of one's life, faux safety of anonymity, rampant misinformation, privacy concerns and its addictiveness. This is why I thought it was best to use Brecht's ideas here. The 2 of us decided that using too many props was unadvisable. We were the sole people on stage who were able to transition between the different scenes, and having too many props would be a hassle. Besides, the play was aiming to stick to Brecht, and making the scenes too realistic by virtue of opulent decorations everywhere would act as a hindrance to the alienation effect that we were trying to achieve. However, there was still a very important prop. In fact, the entire play revolves around it. Alwyn's phone. Okay, ignore the time please, thank you very much. In the early stages of the play, our set was a mess. Here is a photo of it. This photograph is from December 13th, 2023, which was when we had a general story, but there was an unfinished script and many inconsistencies and other issues. The play was unfinished in all aspects, and the props were no outlier. When we compare this to the final design we used for the first scene, the alienating and liminal set is much more apparent. The same idea was applied to scene 2, 6 and 7, which are all set in Alwyn's house. Initially, there was a sofa to make the set feel more homely. Think back to my performance of a monologue by Blanche in A Streetcar Named Desire, written by Tennessee Williams. The set that I designed for that performance was more intentionally home-like. Warm, cozy, decorated, like a home, where like people live. But in this case, to make the audience feel less welcome, as mean as that sounds, I decided to scrap the sofa as a whole, replacing it with 2 black blocks. Scenes 4 and 5 stayed semi-consistent throughout the process of creating the piece. The idea was for this to be the scene where Alwyn and Mikey meet again, and we went through different things we could do. At one point, we thought scene 4 should be Alwyn and Mikey in the car together on the way to the office, but when our teacher pointed out all of the mistakes that our driver was making, it seemed too much of a hassle. We then decided to make it a phone call, just before their next meeting that will take place in the play, thus allowing us to keep the set intact, and alleviating us of having to carry out an extra scene transition. Those are not easy. Since Mikey was already within his office during scene 3, having him stay there to make the call to Alwyn before he comes to visit in the next scene just made sense. We were able to keep the set the same for 3 scenes, which were scenes 3, 4 and 5. Then, scene 6 and 7 went back to Alwyn's house. Many of the items for that scene were on stage already. Between Mikey's office and Alwyn's house, most of the items used on the set were the same, all that differed were their positions. Our costumes was something that we weren't all too worried about throughout the process of creating the piece. All I really thought about was how many times I would need to change. Ideally, I would have had to change twice, but this ended up happening only once. I'll go into a bit more detail about it in the 3rd video about evaluating the play. Ed and I designed the lighting on January 30th and 31st of 2024. There were 6 different lights we had to design, even though there were 7 scenes. This is because scenes 4 and 5 had the same exact lights as each other. Let's talk about them in order, and I'll use my limited knowledge of how colours work to explain what our ideas were for the light designs. It might be important to note that the final performance was experiencing some glitchy occurrences within the realm of the lighting board, and the lights reflected it quite transparently. As a result, almost all of the colours were off, some more than others. During that performance, I asked some audience members what they thought of the lights, and they said that it all kind of seemed alright. It didn't make the play unwatchable at the very least. Nobody's to blame for this technical issue, sometimes things just happen. For scene 1, we tried to go with a coffee shop. Through a minimal set, 6 LED lights, and a white face lighting. The colours we decided to use were creamy white and dark orange, giving a brown effect in the LED lights. And those colours were kind of like brown for coffee and then white for milk. Something that the play utilises quite often was the lights coming through the back wings, and this had a few purposes. One was to remind the audience that there were wings at all, and to remember that the play is artificial and performative, in short, to alienate the audience. Something else that these lights did was allow us to add more colour to the stage. Oftentimes, the lights coming in from the back were slightly different or drastically different colours to those coming downstage or centre stage. In scene 2, it was up to me to design some lights for Alwyn. The shenanigan happening on his social media took place during the night time, so I basically just went with a very nocturnal colour palette. Scene 3 was done by Ed, so he may wish to talk about this on his website, but scenes 4 and 5 were set in the same location, so I thought it'd be nice to keep the exact same positions for the lights. But the only thing that changes is the colour. The colour faded to a sterile white, to show how Mikey and therapists at large have to have a lot of strength to put their personal life aside, to an extent, to work with their clients. That is why the light changes when Mikey says he'd better give Alwyn a call. Scene 6 is also set in Alwyn's house. This time is during the late morning. There are beams of a brilliant sunny yellow coming through onto the stage, along with a nice warm white tone lighting up the set. All of the scenes except scene 7 have a white face lighting, and scene 2 has it a very tiny bit dimmer because of the violets, purples and blues, which easily get drowned out by other colours because of the human's eyes' lesser sensitivity for blue as compared to green, alongside the fact that humans have no violet receptors, meaning we just have to rely on our blue cones to see violet. Fun fact, that is why violet looks very dark. It's not because the light is physically darker, it's because our eyes are not evolved to be sensitive to it. Scene 7 has my favourite lighting, and I'm glad that it stayed quite true to its original design in our performance. All of the lights are the same colour, a harsh, cold bluish white. Very bright, all 6 focused on the table where Alwyn sits. This is another instance of an unrealistic effect, which aimed to remind the audience that even though this is based on a real-life idea and a real-life issue, there are aspects that are artificial. The lights focus on Alwyn as he reads through Mikey's letter to him about the unfortunate situation in which Mikey has committed suicide. After reading it, he sits still and the play ends abruptly. We decided to go with some soothing jazz music that you might hear in a coffee shop for the opening and scene transitions. The point was that it was repeating in the scene transitions, which was another aspect of alienation that we included. So what about the pieces I wrote for the production? This was one of the final steps I took to make this performance as fleshed out as possible. I'll quickly go over the different aspects of the music, mostly talking about what they represent or portray in the specific context of our play, because I could talk about the pieces in general for a long time, but this video is already monstrous.
So monstrous, in fact, that I have been editing it for 13 hours.
Oh no!
Sorry, just dying. No worries.
There were 2 pieces of music that I wrote for the play, and I'm exceptionally amazing at naming things, so they are called Rhys which means Rhys in the Spotlight music, and the other one is called Untitled March 13th, 2024. Truly inspiring. The first one that plays in the audio track of scene 7 is the Untitled one. It's very fast and has a recognisable glockenspiel sound. The high-pitched instruments in this piece were meant to be able to be heard underneath the actor's voice as they read the letter, without drowning them out. It's also in 5/4, which means there are 5 beats per bar. 5 crunchy beats, if you like music. Odd meters and odd time signatures is something that I do a lot in the music that I write, especially in something that's supposed to be background music for anything like a performance or an animation, because the regular irregularity is something exciting and newish for an average listener, but not too drastic or irregular that it sounds bad, or that it sounds like not good, which is bad, because not good is bad. The theme everyone knows from Mission Impossible also uses a 5/4 time signature. The second piece, has a harp, a celeste, which is similar to a piano, but it uses bells instead of strings, and a cello doing pizzicato, which is when the strings are plucked with the fingers. Like boing, boing. The time signature for this piece is 11/8. Which means there are 11 beats per bar, but the beats are twice as fast as the beats would be in 5/4, so 5/4 is like 10/8, but this is 11/8. And it sounds a lot less regular than 5/4, even though it's really, really similar in terms of the length that 1 bar of music is. I've noticed that when meters like 11/8 are played really quickly, they still sound quite nice, and they still sound quite regular. This piece did not need to have instruments at a very high end of the pitch spectrum because it was not underneath anything else like voice or dialogue. This piece was played in the closing of the play. Another thing to mention about it is that the key changes very quickly and drastically. This is a callback to the erratic motion the story took in scene 7.
If you could break one law, what would that be?
Probably tax fraud.
Well, thank you everybody for listening to me talk and talk and talk about the process of creation we embarked on to make this piece of theatre. It was a lot, but in the end it was really nice and it taught us a lot of things. Creating your own pieces is important because you can make money off the copyright. And you additionally do not have to pay for the copyright of anybody else.
Unless you copy someone else's work, but don't do that because that's very naughty.
It also keeps performing arts and theatre alive and thriving. Alright people, thanks again for watching. The next 2 videos will not be this long. Please stay tuned. They'll be posted to my YouTube channel and my website in due time. Rhys, out.